So this factoring one. Do you guys have any questions on this one? There's some trickier factoring pieces there scattered throughout, so I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity that if you had questions about anything, that you could, thank you. She's learning from home, so she's not here. Thanks. Did anybody have anything from this factoring worksheet that they wanted to ask about? Oh, hold on. Sydney Schulte. Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Okay. So the first thing that I notice is that this isn't quadratic, right? Because we have an x to the third. However, if I look at all three terms of our polynomial here, I notice they all contain a greatest common factor of x. So I would begin by factoring that off. And now the piece that I'm left with is quadratic, right? So this I can handle. So I'm going to look for the two numbers that multiply to give me 4 times 30, and then add to give me 43. And that should be 40 and 3, right? Oops. Okay. So I have, moving down here, and I'll make my two groups. From the first group, I can take out a 4x. From the second group, I can take out a 3. And the x plus 10 is in common with each, leaving me with. So there is my fully factored answer. You'll notice here, if we look along the way, that when I took out this x, it just kind of stayed out front the whole way through. Once I factored it out, it never came into play again. I just hung on to it all the way till the end. Sydney, is that okay? Of course. Anybody else? I saw some other hands kind of timidly raised before I called on Sydney, but if there's anyone else that would like to talk about one of these, I'd be happy to do another. Enzo? 13? Okay. So here I notice that I have two variables. I have n's and b's, which seems like it's going to be a problem, but if I look closely, I notice there's a b in all of the all three places there on all the terms. So I can just factor that out to make life a little bit easier. In addition, if I look at the coefficients, 30, 87, and 30, I notice that there's a greatest common factor among those numbers, that they're all divisible by 3. So that's what I'm going to take out as a 3b. Cool with that so far? Okay. And again, just like before, once I factor that stuff out front, I'm never touching it again. It just hangs out front until the very end. So I need to find my two numbers that multiply to give me 10 times 10, or 100, and add to give me negative 29. Well, I see what those two numbers are. It's -5 and -4. So I'm going to have 3b times 10n squared minus 25n plus a -4n plus 10. And then I'll make my two groups. Note here that instead of writing that as -4n, I wrote it as plus a negative, because I remember I need to have a plus sign in between my two groups. So rather than writing it as a subtraction, I wrote it as plus a negative, so I can still have that plus sign there. Enzo, are you okay so far? Okay. From the first group, we can take out a 5n, leaving me with 2n minus 5. From the second group, we can take out a -2, leaving me with 2n minus 5. Now, it was important I took a -2 out at that second group rather than a +2, because it made a 2n minus 5 factor in both. Everybody catch that, Enzo? You see what I'm saying there? Okay. And now my final step is to just take out the 2n minus 5, leaving with the 5n minus 2. And there's my final answer. Feel okay on that one? Okay. What others? Megan? 10? Sure. Okay. So again, we notice right away that it's not quadratic because we have an n to the fourth, but if I look at all three terms, they all contain a greatest common factor of n squared, so that's not a big deal. We'll just take that out. If I look at the coefficients, they all contain a greatest common factor of 4. So I'll start by taking out a 4n squared. And then I need to find the two numbers that multiply to give me -140 and add to give me +4. Well, that's 14 and -10. We'll do that. Is that okay so far, Megan? Okay. So I'll rewrite that then as 7n squared plus 14n. And then plus a -10n minus 20. And I'll make my two groups. Again, notice that instead of writing minus 10n, I wrote plus a -10n because I need that plus sign in the middle of my two groups. From the first group, I can take out a 7n, leave me with n plus 2. From the second group, I can take out a -10, leaving me with n plus 2. I notice then I have an n plus 2 in both, leaving me with 7n minus 10 as my leftovers, and there's my final answer. Megan, you happy with that? Okay. Are there any others on this sheet before we move to the next one? I'm happy to do more, but it's been a little bit like pulling teeth to get you guys to volunteer if you had questions, which is fine, no big deal. But it feels like we've kind of run its course on this one. If you guys are ready to move to the next one, we can move to the next one. If you still have more here, though, that's okay. Alrighty. Like 6 then we'll take a look at. So looking at homework 6, on homework 6 we were solving. Does anybody have questions from homework 6? Megan? Number 9? Sure. So the first thing I'm going to do on number 9 is get everything onto one side so that it's equal to 0. Remember that if we're solving by factoring, we're going to rely on the zero product property. So whatever we factor has to be equal to 0 in order to use that property. So add 3v squared to both sides, and then subtract 6v from both sides. That'll give me v squared minus 7v plus 12 equal to 0. Since the leading coefficient here is 1, I can do this using the shortcut. So I just need to find two things that multiply to give me 12 and add to give me negative 7. That would be negative 3 and negative 4. And then I can set each of those two factors equal to 0 and solve. So when I add 3 to both sides, I get v equals 3. When I add both sides, I get v equals 4. So those are my two solutions. Does that feel okay, Megan? Good. So remember on this, yes?
Sorry, no, go ahead. I'll ask after.
Okay, so remember on this sheet we are solving, so there is still some work to do after you've got it factored. When I was checking the homework from last weekend, I saw some of your guys' work on these sheets. And it looked like a lot of us were just factoring and not going that extra step to solve. So make sure that when we're solving, we do that zero product property at the end and separate them. Joe, what's up?
Could you do number 7, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
No problem. So for number 7, again, we are solving. So if we're going to solve by factoring, we need to apply the zero product property. So the first thing we need to do is make it equal to 0. So add 35v to both sides. Notice that there's not a regular v term on the left side there. So there's no place to combine it to, so it's just going to go there in the middle. Then if I look here, the coefficients, 7, 35, and 42, those all contain a greatest common factor of 7. So I'm going to start by factoring a 7 off. And that's really nice because it now turns this into a shortcut problem. I just need to find the two numbers that multiply to give me negative 6 and add to give me positive 5. Well, that would be positive 6 and negative 1. And then I can apply the zero product property. So I set each of these factors equal to 0 and solve them each independently. 7 does not equal 0. There's no solution for that part. Subtract 6 from both sides. I have one answer is negative 6. Add 1 from to both sides, and I have my other answer is positive 1. So just because there was no solution to the 7 equals 0 part, that doesn't matter. I keep going and solve all the three parts separately. And then any answers I get from any of those three parts are an answer. So just because I have one part that doesn't have no solution doesn't mean the whole problem is no solution. Joe, are you happy with that?
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Factoring off that 7 made life a lot easier than having to try to sort through doing the long factoring technique for that. So making sure to kind of check on that is a good place to start whenever you see the leading coefficient isn't 1. Take a moment and check to see, well, can I take a greatest common factor out and make this problem either easier or make it so easy that it's down to one of the shortcuts. That's helpful. Megan. No, I mean if you didn't deal with that, that's okay. The reason I do that though is if instead, for instance, this was like 7v instead, I don't want to get used to just ignoring the stuff out front, because if there's a variable attached to it, that now has an answer to it. That's something we can solve for. So I don't want to get in the habit of just ignoring it. Although in this case, you could certainly have ignored it and it wouldn't have hurt. Does that make sense? Okay. Others from this sheet. Happy to do some more. These are good questions you guys are asking. Yes, Miss Gruden. 11. Sure. Again, my first step is going to get it to equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 7r squared from both sides. That leaves me with r squared plus 3r plus 2 equal to 0. So I can use a shortcut here. I need to find the two numbers that multiply to give me 2 and add to give me 3. Well, so when I apply the zero product property, I can say r plus 2 equals 0 and r plus 1 equals 0. So when I subtract 2 from both sides, I get r equals -1. And subtract 1 from both sides, I get r equals -1. Is that cool? No problem. So again, you're saying an important first step is to make sure that we're getting the thing equal to 0, right? If we weren't doing that before, that causes big problems. Got to make sure that we're equal to 0 to start with before we start trying to do any kind of factoring there. This solve by factoring technique is wholly reliant on that as our very first step to make sure our equation is equal to 0 before we start moving forward. We can take one or two more if you guys still have questions. If you don't, that's okay. But I figured I'd offer. Yes, Elizabeth? Sure. So I'm going to just start by subtracting the 2 over. Now notice that there's not another regular number on the left-hand side, so I can't combine the -2 with anything, so I'll just write it on the end. So there I just need to find, it's another shortcut situation, right, because the leading coefficient is 1. So find two numbers that multiply to give us -2 and add to give us 1. Well, that's +2 and -1. So when I 0, I get -2 and I get +1. Of course, no problem. Megan. 13? Sure. So here we'll start by moving 65n over, and there's no other n terms to combine that with, so that's just going to kind of get written there in the middle. Notice whenever I'm doing this, I'm always writing these in kind of like that standard form, like the squared term, the n, the regular variable, and then the constant at the end. So let's check to see if there's a greatest common factor. Now I can't take the whole 10 out, because obviously 65 and 35 aren't divisible by 10, but everything is divisible by 5. So let's take that out, because that'll make life a little bit easier, because it makes all the numbers a little bit smaller. It'll be easier to find our two numbers later on. So we need to find the two numbers that multiply to give us 2 times negative 7, that's negative 14, and then add to give us negative 13. Well, that's negative 14 and positive 1. So I have 5 times 2n squared minus 14n plus 1n 7 equal to 0. I'll make my two groups. Greatest common factor from the first group is 2n, leaving me with n minus 7. The greatest common factor from the second group is just 1, because there's nothing in common between n and 7 other than 1. So I can now take out the n minus 7, leave me with 2n plus 1. And then I can set each of these pieces equal to 0 and solve them separately. So 5 equals 0, that has no solution. Add 7 to both sides, I get n equals 7. Subtract 1 from both sides and then divide by 2. It's going to be negative 1/2. So those are my two answers. That one was a little bit longer because we had to do the long factoring method. There wasn't a shortcut method available to us, but that's okay. We can still kind of handle that. Megan, are you happy there? So hopefully you're getting used to this longer factoring method, right? It's the same steps really every time. Usually the trickiest part is finding the two numbers. Once you find the two numbers, it's kind of all the same after that. So it's one of those you just need a little bit of practice, but it's more or less the same skill set as the shortcuts are. There's just a little bit more to do. Okay. You guys feel better about these sheets here? I hope so, right? It's essentially still just factoring, right? There's not much more to do when we solve something by factoring than there was just factoring. That being said, what we're going to do now is we're going to do another factoring practice. So we'll do a little 5-minute factoring practice here. So this one that we're going to do is the factoring practice 6. Those of you at home, it's in the content library if you'd like to follow along with us. If you want to do it later, you can always time yourself. It's not a big deal. But that's what we're going to do for the next few minutes here, and then we're going to move on and talk about some more solving techniques that we can do. So if you guys can make a spot for yourselves to do this, that would be good. If you go face down on your desk until I tell you to flip it and start. Obviously, you can use a calculator if you want. There's nothing on here that you need a calculator to do. But you can use one if you like. Again, there's no penalties for right and wrongs. we're just going to do a little bit of practice here before we move on to something new. So with this one, a little bit different. Not every one of these factoring problems on here can be done with the shortcut. And not even all of them are going to be factored. So there's going to be a little bit trickier here because there's going to be some of these that you have to do the long way. And there's going to be some of them that you can't even do at all. So we have to be a little bit more, pay a little bit more attention about what's going on, but that's okay. We've talked about how to deal with all these situations, and we saw today, before we are going over these homeworks, we saw a lot of examples of how to do that full method, right? So that we should be fairly comfortable. That should be fairly fresh in our minds on what to do there. So we'll take 5 minutes to do this because some of these problems are a little bit trickier. See how it goes. On your marks, get set, begin. What is just don't want you